Hi there. We're here for class 13, the beginning of our week 7 for Introduction to Judaism. And today we're going to start our week 7 on the Sephardim. Last week having done the Ashkenazi tradition, and we're in our Middle Ages unit or our medieval unit. So that's where we are. Today you have a 13-minute video that I'm asking you to watch on Islam because it's kind of impossible to understand Sephardic and Mizrahi traditions without knowing something about Islam. So I'm asking you to watch a brief introduction to Islam to make sure we're on the same page. So today's lecture should be about an hour. Try anyway. We got a lot to cover. I'm Holly, or Dr. Pierce, as you prefer. My office hours are Thursdays at 4, so today at 4 via Zoom. You don't need an appointment for that. You can just come see me then. Or email me anytime if you have questions or you need to meet with me. Okay, so week 7, we are going to be looking at the forms of Judaism, or sort of the flavors of Judaism. Remember, we're largely still talking about Rabbinic Judaism in the Middle Ages. The flavors of Rabbinic Judaism that grew out of the Islamic world rather than the Christian world, because that's where we were with the Ashkenazi last week. So the Sephardim and the Mizrahi traditions were largely influenced by Islam instead of Christianity. So obviously, living under Islam instead of Christianity led to different developments in the different culture and interpretations of Jews in these regions. Also, of course, a different geography, but a different socio-political, economic situation for the most part. Sephardic Jews tended to be more cosmopolitan than Ashkenazi Jews, meaning they were more citizens of the world, if you will. They could travel more freely. They generally integrated more in non-Jewish society. For the most part, they were less restricted, and in many instances, they had more prosperity, more wealth, more stability than Ashkenazi Jews. And this did change the way that the minhag and the general outlook in society of these Jewish communities developed. Now, our emphasis today will be on Spain. Now, you might be wondering why we didn't cover Spain more when we talked about Christian Europe, and that's because Spain is a really complicated example in the Middle Ages, because it wasn't always part of Christian Europe. Spain spent a good portion of the Middle Ages as part of the Islamic world. The reason we're focusing so much on Spain is it's the cradle of Sephardic tradition, and it's also one of the major centers of the Jewish world in the Middle Ages. And in fact, when we look at the Mizrahi and the Sephardim, we are looking at two of the major powerhouses of medieval Judaism. Islamic Spain and its golden age, which we'll be looking at today. And of course, Mizrahi cultural groups contain Babylon. And if you've been following the course, you do know that Babylon is something of a pretty significant site of Judaism, Jewish life, Jewish production. So that's where we are this week. Today we'll be looking primarily at history. Class 14, next Tuesday, we will be looking at culture, cultural productivity, specifically developments in Judaism, and some major figures, particularly rabbis, obviously. So this week you had a reading from the textbook, which, remember, is available as an ebook through the library, or you can purchase. And you had a primary text reading, the Pact of Umar, which we'll talk about today, is a significant Muslim document relating to medieval Jewish life. Okay, so we are again in the Middle Ages in a state of diaspora, beginning in the 2nd century CE, which we call sort of the Great Diaspora. Jews moving out of Israel, out of Jerusalem under the Romans, into, of course, Babylon, where Jews had already been established, into Europe, in by the 6th, 7th, 8th century throughout the Roman Empire and into Europe itself, particularly in the Shum settlements, which we looked at last week. Now, for Jews of Europe in 1096, with the First Crusade, their situation changes a great deal in Europe, and many of those Jews move into Eastern Europe, which is areas which are now Poland and Russia. So we get the Ashkenazi flourishing of Yiddish culture in those places, even though they begin in Germany. In 1096 as well, we get a decline in the power that the Babylonian communities and the academies had over Ashkenazi Judaism, because lines of communication between Europe and the East sort of break down through the instability that war brings. So it's in 1096, and after that the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition flourishes sort of on its own steam and relies less on the academies of Babylonia. But from the 2nd century till the 11th century, the academies of Babylon were sort of the things, as well as Spain. Now, the Jews of Spain started there very early. They've been there. They were there throughout the Roman Empire in Spain, and they exist there still. But certainly they flourished there until throughout the Islamic period in Spain and into the Christian period until 1492. And we'll talk about all that today. But that's just sort of our weather forecast here, so we can start to place these together as part of simultaneous timelines, so you don't get confused as to what was happening when. So in this unit, we are specifically looking at Ashkenazi and the Sephardim and the Mizrahi. Now, the Ashkenazi is European Jews, the Yiddish culture of European Jews in Europe. The Sephardim refers specifically to the Jews of the Spanish Arabian Peninsula during the Islamic hold of Spain. And Sephardim refers to Jews originating in Spain and to some extent North Africa and other places, because the Sephardim did migrate to North Africa and other places and maintained their separate Sephardic identities. And so the Sephardim originated in Spain, but they moved to other places and continued to develop Sephardic culture in other places. Jews originating in North Africa are actually referred to or refer to themselves often as Maghrebi, which is the Arabic term for Northern Africa. Maghrebi Jews are sometimes affiliated with Sephardic traditions, and sometimes affiliated with Mizrahi traditions, and sometimes consider themselves to be distinct from both. So this is not an exact science with these terms. It really, a lot of it depends on how people perceive themselves, and I'm a big proponent of people being able to name themselves. So keep in mind that I'm using these terms in ways that I hope are useful to you, but real life is messy and people use them in all sorts of different ways, so keep that in mind. The other major group or cultural, what we refer to as a Kulturbereich or a cultural region, are the Mizrahi or the Eastern Jews, and Mizrahi means Eastern, and the Mizrahi sort of identity specifically describes Jews of the Middle East. Specifically, the Jews of Babylon. And obviously these are sort of the big heroes of the early diaspora. So if you're wondering what happened to the Babylonian Jews, well, the Babylonian Jews became the core of the Mizrahi Jewish tradition. Now, Mizrahi Judaism cultural flavor is very similar to Sephardic, because particularly in 1492, but in other times as well, in the 12th century and so on, Sephardic Jews did migrate in large numbers into Mizrahi territories, and Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews had a lot in common, both developing under Islam. Their Judaisms were compatible, so you get a lot of intermarriage and a lot of intermingling between Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews. So oftentimes, Mizrahi Judaism is very similar to Sephardic Judaism, and often people will use the term the Sephardic Mizrahi tradition or the Hispanic Arabic tradition to describe both. Remember, all of these are rabbinic Jews, particularly Babylonian Jews, because that's where the big rabbinic academies were located. So the history of the Mizrahi Jews is rooted in the 6th century BCE. So very, very old communities, people who did not return to the land after the Babylonian exile, but maintained ties to the land. And in 70 CE and in 135 CE, the Jewish communities of Babylon became much more important in the Jewish world as sites of rabbinic learning, rabbinic academies, and sites of also money and support and structures and leadership and the preservation of texts. So the Babylonian community, honestly, one of the big reasons that Judaism still exists is because of the Babylonian communities. The Mizrahi Jews and their ancestors. So the Jews of Babylon, the Mizrahi Jews, came under Islamic rule starting in about the 7th century onward in different places. We will talk a little bit about sort of the decline of the Babylonian academies in a moment. But Mizrahi Jews are like Sephardic Jews in that their heritage is multilingual. The Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino, which is sort of often described as Judeo-Hispanic language. It's Spanish and Hebrew and Arabic sort of merged. So Ladino is to the Sephardic community what Yiddish is to the Ashkenazi community. Mizrahi Jews obviously don't identify that much with Ladino unless they adopted it from Sephardic ancestors who moved into the areas. Mizrahi Jews traditionally have spoken sort of one of a series of Judeo-Iranian languages, which come out of the Sassanid or the later Persian Empire. And Mizrahi Jews also tend to identify with Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic and Hebrew sort of blended. And obviously the Mizrahi have at their core Aramaic, because that was the language spoken at the Babylonian academies, and of course straight up Arabic, which the Sephardic Jews also spoke. Sephardic Jews tended to speak not only Ladino at home, but Arabic in public spaces, and they also learned Hebrew and Aramaic, and also usually Greek for a full Sephardic education. They were usually also are educated in Greek. Mizrahi Jews today tend to be those whose ancestry originates in what we would call today Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, Yemen. So quite a patchwork of places now, but at the time were unified under larger Islamic rule. And of course with great influence from the Sephardic intermingling. If we consider under Mizrahi the widest definition of it, which is not only the Jews of the Middle East, but also the southern former Soviet countries and even further east, And if we consider Maghrebi Jews to be Mizrahi as well, and the Sephardim that moved into the Middle East, the Mizrahi cultural group may actually be one of the largest cultural groups within Judaism. But it often gets very little attention. And this is kind of down to prejudice and bias within the way we talk about Judaism and the way we think about Judaism and sort of the public face of Judaism. The Sephardim had more money than Mizrahis did, generally speaking, and there is classism at work there, but there's also racism at work. As I've mentioned before, unfortunately, global Judaism is not impervious to racism. You know, Jews did not invent racism necessarily, but unfortunately we got awfully good at it. And not all Mizrahi Jews are Jews of color, but a good number of them are. And generally speaking, we tend to emphasize white Jews and white Jewish history and white Jewish perspectives over that of Jews of color. And this is a struggle that is continuing within the Jewish community, like it's continuing within hopefully all communities that we need to address this and move on from it. Hopefully, in Unit 3, we will have time to talk about the problem of the Ashkenazi hegemony within European and North American ways of talking about Judaism. That is the way that the Ashkenazi tradition is often seen as the normal form of Judaism, and to a lesser extent Sephardic, but certainly Mizrahi traditions are often either ignored altogether or are seen as sort of exotic, alien flavors or exotic artifacts, but not often taken as very important in terms of global Judaism. And this is obviously not the case. If it was not for the Mizrahi Jews, the world over probably would not be in existence anymore. So if you're talking about sheer numbers, if you're talking about productivity, if you're talking about importance in terms of history, the Mizrahi tradition is where it's at. And it becomes a rather significant powerhouse in the Middle Ages, particularly in concert with the Sephardic tradition. And there are politics there between Mizrahi and Sephardim that I'm not going to touch on because I don't belong to either of these groups. But just know that these are very, very complex relationships, okay? So, from the 7th century onward, pretty much the majority of Jews in the world lived under Arab or Islamic rule. And the Islamic world was sort of the heart of Judaism in the early Middle Ages. So under Islam, you get sort of a mixed bag of some Jews are poor and some Jews are wealthy. With wealthy Jews often supplying charity and Jewish education. In many ways, the Sephardim sort of invented public schools because it became tradition within the Sephardic world. If you had money, it was your obligation to provide free education to the families to the Jewish families that didn't have money. So one of the big differences between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi is there were wealthy Jews that provided libraries and schools and charities and hospitals for less wealthy Jews. And this led to higher rates of literacy, it led to higher rates of health, it led to higher rates of the standard of quality of living amongst Jews entirely throughout the Islamic world. As I said, the Jews of this world tended to be multilingual, and they tended to travel more. Ashkenazi Jews were often forbidden to travel. Jews under Islamic rule had a certain type of citizenship. They weren't full citizens of the Islamic world, but they were citizens enough that they were allowed to travel within the Islamic world quite easily for the most part. And they were largely more integrated into non-Jewish society than what we see in Christian Europe. So the Eastern diaspora has its roots in Babylonia, as I've said, and very old, obviously, from the 6th century BCE with the Babylonian exile. The early diaspora of the Middle Ages, from the 2nd to 7th century, pre-Islam, really focused on Jewish life in Babylonia at the academies. And Jews of Babylonia and Jews of the world all over in the early diaspora looked to the exilarchs of Babylonia. So those were the heads, the Jewish leaders of civil life in Babylon. And they also looked to the Goans in Babylon. These are the heads of the rabbinic academies. So you have the exilarchs that led civil life, and you had the Goans that led religious life in Babylon. And this really was the core of Jewish life, Jewish leadership in the early diaspora. The exiles and the structures that were in Babylon were crucial, essential to maintaining the Jewish calendar, to maintaining Jewish law, to maintaining Judaism in the early diaspora as Jews worked to find their footings in other places. And obviously Babylon was also essential in funding the establishment of Jewish communities throughout the world. The Goanic period, the period of these heads of the academies, is an incredibly, intensely productive period in terms of literature, religion, and philosophy. And the Goanic period is also marked by the sort of absorption of Greek and Islamic philosophy and science. So the rabbinic academies also became places of science and scientific inquiry during this period under the influence of Greek thought and Islamic thought. And there was a great deal of cooperation between the Islamic schools and the Jewish rabbinic academies. And in fact, the rabbinic academies were quite essential to early Islam in developing its own processes of jurisprudence. So that's why within classical Islam and classical rabbinic Judaism, there are great overlaps in the processes of what it means to be a master of the law and how to apply that law to real life. So Judaism and Islam sort of grew together in Babylon in really significant ways that influence both religions. Unfortunately, the last Goan was killed in 1038 by an offshoot, sort of an extreme sect of Muslims in 1038. The Goan Hezekiah was killed, and the Goanic period sort of fades to an end, and then is followed by the Reshonim, which I talked about last week. And of course, in 1096, with the Crusades, the communication between the academies of Babylon and the Jewish communities of Europe is disrupted, and the Babylonian academies become less significant for many Jews in the world in terms of as a place of the origination of the law. Jews moved into Spain under the Romans, certainly, and they lived in Spain under the Romans until 472, at which point the Visigoths, a sort of tribal ethnic group in Europe, took Spain from the Romans, and they converted to Catholicism in the 5th century. So Jews in Spain lived under Catholic Visigoths until 711, when the Muslims took Spain. And this is when we began sort of the beginning of the Jewish golden age in Spain, because I promise you, I know that Muslim-Jewish relations today are at a low point. Some might say sort of an aberrational low point. But in the Middle Ages, the Jewish Golden Age was under Islam, and we have a period of really intense cooperation and tolerance and coexistence under Islam that we simply don't see in Christian Europe. So we'll get more on that in a moment. So the relationship between Islam and Judaism in the Middle Ages is marked with tolerance. It's marked with an embracing of commonalities, and it's marked mostly with peaceful coexistence. Now, people are complicated and history is complex, so obviously this varies from place to place and time to time. And there are moments like the murder of the Goan Hezekiah where they don't get along at all. But for the most part, Islam and Judaism are strong sibling faiths that share a common origin and generally recognize that common origin. And this has led to peaceful and productive coexistence where both Islam and Judaism benefits from a mutually respectful relationship. Historically speaking, that has been the reality. Okay, so a moment here to talk about Islam. I would encourage you now to pause this lecture and go down and watch the 13-minute introduction to Islam that I have posted, another crash course video, because you gotta love the Green Brothers. But so I encourage you to pause this and go watch that now, so that I know that we all have the nuts and bolts of Islam before we move on. Okay, so obviously, the beginning of Islam begins with the Prophet Muhammad, who in 610 CE receives what is referred to in the Islamic tradition as the final revelation, the final divine revelation. Muhammad is understood to be the last prophet, and his revelation is the Quran. Now, what I mean by last prophet is Islam considers all of the major figures of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian tradition to have been prophets from God. So Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, these are all prophets of God. Now, Jesus is not God himself, but he is a prophet of God, and Muhammad is the last prophet sent by God, having seen his message misinterpreted or abused by the Jews and misinterpreted by the Christians. God tries once more with Muhammad, who is the final prophet. Muhammad, by the way, is not divine. He is fully human. The same way as the Jews recognize Moses as being an incredibly important figure, but fully human. So this marks Islam and Judaism as similar, in contrast to Christianity, that view Jesus as being both human and God, which is not something that Judaism or Islam could deal with. So Islam and Judaism from the get-go, both ethical monotheistic traditions with the same God, and they share that God with Christianity. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are sibling religions. And Islam did not have within it a tradition of anti-Semitism. In fact, most Muslims were themselves Semitic people. So Jews and Arabs shared not only an ideological origin, but also a geographic hereditary origin as well, and a language. Both Arabic and Hebrew are Semitic languages. So obviously this helped. Islam did not have a native anti-Semitism. That was something that was imported much later during the colonial period. By anti-Semitism here, I mean anti-Judaic anti-Semitism, because it gets complicated, because you can refer to a hatred of Arabs as also anti-Semitism, because we're all Semites, right? But Islam didn't have an indigenous understanding of inherently understanding Jews as evil or demonic or inferior. And that certainly helped. They also did not lay the blame for the murder of Jesus on the Jews entire, which is also an incredibly big difference between Jewish life under Islam versus Jewish life under Christianity in the Middle Ages. So Islam is the third great Abrahamic monotheistic faith. They have the Prophet Muhammad as the last prophet and the Quran as the divine revelation of Muhammad. They also, most Muslims also hold great reverence for the hadiths, which is the stories of the Prophet and his early life, or his during his life. Quran is divine revelation, but hadith you can consider sacred history or important history or hagiography, the life of the Prophet and the things that the Prophet did during his life, which can be pretty important in terms of how a Muslim is supposed to live. They can look at stories of how Muhammad lived and make decisions, religious decisions based on that. And Islam is rooted in what is often referred to as the 5 pillars of Islam. The Shahada, the pronouncement of faith, rather similar to the Shema in Judaism. Salah, or prayer, like Jews, Muslims prayed multiple times a day. Zakah, which is charity, zakat, the obligation to provide charity, particularly to the vulnerable. Fasting during Ramadan, which commemorates the revelation of the Quran. And the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca. All of these pillars of Islam were things that Jews could understand. Jews and Muslims, and indeed Christians, share emphasis on charity and prayer, and a emphasis on credos, or like the pronouncement of faith, and fasting are things. Fasting was something that Jews and Muslims could certainly understand. They had that in common as well. So Islam and Judaism, and indeed Christianity, were not incompatible religions. They had a lot in common origin, and the religions themselves shared a lot of commonalities. And this was a great site for cooperation. Charity has always been something that religions could cooperate on, because most religions have an idea of charity, and helping the poor and the sick and the vulnerable is something that most religions can agree on. So aside from anti-Semitism and the Christ killer accusation, the other big difference between the Islamic world and the Christian world is Jews were simply never as foreign to Muslims as they were to Christians in Europe. Jewish cultures originated in the same sort of geographies and climates as most Muslim cultures. They originated in the same places. They shared the same kinds of foods and the same kind of dress and the same kinds of artistic expressions. Jewish homes were largely indistinguishable from Muslim homes. So Jews were just not as foreign in the Muslim world as they were in the Christian world. And this led to a lot less mistrust, a lot less fear, a lot less prejudice in general. The kosher regulations and the halal regulations of Islam were similar. So Jews and Muslims felt perhaps more comfortable with each other in terms of their dietary habits. Many of their holidays and their cultural practices, their religious practices, were familiar enough to each other, at least, to not look strange or appear threatening. Now, history and ideology are a bit different, right? So the majority of the issues between Muslims and Jews was not a matter of ideology, but instead a matter of history. The establishment of the Ummah, or the Muslim global community, came with certain amounts of friction with Jewish communities existing in those places that resisted resisted Islam, and that did cause some historical tensions within. And unfortunately, those historical tensions are somewhat reflected within early Muslim texts. And again, when polemics become sacred texts, they can cause issues. But generally speaking, the Quran and the Hadith and early Islamic documents are not as anti-Judaic as early Christian documents, and that was helpful as well. So the early caliphs under the Umayyads, the Umayyad dynasty focused a lot on expansion and were largely tolerant of the people of the book, so ethical monotheists like Christians and Jews. This is followed by a period of stability under the Abbasids, who were less concentrated on expansion, but more stable, and therefore is a period of flourishing in terms of the arts and so forth. And the Abbasids were also likewise fairly tolerant. So the expansion of Islam from that point on is incredibly complex, and I sadly don't have time to focus or dwell on the history of Islam. It's important to know something about Islam as we talk about Judaism and its relationship to Islam in the Middle Ages. But suffice it to say that Islamic rule, Islamic ideals, Islamic attitudes vary from place to place and from time to time. Generally speaking, there was a lot of similarity between Islam and Judaism. They shared origins and ideals, but there were also points of friction as well. There is within Islam this ideology that God had tried to reveal himself to the Jews and they fumbled, and then he tried to reveal himself to the Christians and they fumbled, and the Muslims were the ones to get it right. And obviously that's going to result in some animosity. The new revelation replacing the old covenant, we get with this a sense of triumphalism, we get this with a sense of replacement theology, and we get a sense of supersessionism, the same way as we see within Christianity. Big difference is, for the majority of Islam, there's never an idea that the old covenant with the Jews ever becomes void. And Muslims tend to respect the Jewish relationship with God because they respect that the covenant is still in place. And if from a Muslim perspective, if you love God, you have to respect the relationship that he's established with other people. For the most part, there were Muslim groups that did advocate for that the old covenant had a time limit, or that had expired, or whatever. But for the most part, Islam respected the role that the original covenant with the Jews played in world history and in their own history. So there are moments of competition. There are outbreaks of absolutism where, for example, Muslim groups would say, look, if the Jews are at all right, then we're wrong, so the Jews have to simply be wrong. And you do have more absolutist conservative groups or trends within Islam throughout the period. And of course you have the presence of bits of polemic within Islam. Not as much as we have in Christianity, but they're still there. Polemics on both sides as well. Jews were often a bit critical of Islam as well. The difference being Muslims generally had the power to act on their polemics and Jews didn't. So as I said, Jews in the Quran, the attitudes towards the Jews expressed in the Quran and placed into sacred text are somewhat ambivalent. The prophet viewed Jews with respect. He viewed Judaism with respect, but within early Islam, Jews were expected to convert, and when they didn't, there were moments of hostility. So there is no clear-cut pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish attitude within the Quran, but largely speaking, Jews in the Quran have a much better rep than Jews in the New Testament. From Jewish perspective, Islam was faulty. to some extent. Most Jews did not believe, obviously, that Islam was the renewed revelation of God. But for the most part, Jews viewed Muslims as respectful, decent, ethical people who they could work with. They did not have the problem with Islam that they had with Christianity, which was the divinity of Jesus. At least from a Jewish perspective, Muslims were good monotheists, which did help them get along a bit. Muslim rulership was generally preferable to Christian rulership for very pragmatic reasons, as we've seen. And many Jews also viewed Islam as, I don't want to say their own triumph, but many Jews viewed Islam as a demonstration of how the Jews had been a light to the nations. Here was a huge number of non-Jews coming to God, and many Jews viewed this as a good thing. Judaism has never required all people to become Jews. You don't have to be a Jew to be a good person within Jewish tradition. So there were many Jews who saw Islam as a favorable move towards the nations coming to God. Not coming to Judaism, but coming to God, which within Judaism are slightly different. And I am really running behind here, so I really need to speed up. I'm sorry. Okay. So Islamic policy towards the Jews are definitely influenced by the Quran. And in the Quran, Jews are described as the Dhimma, the people of the book, along with Christians. So as long as someone is a monotheist, and particularly people who hold the Bible as sacred, which is something that Muslims respected and shared, because biblical history was also considered to be Islamic history. As long as Dhimma were humble, as long as they paid a tax, particularly a tax in lieu of military service, you only fought them until they were subdued. And then after that, you made peace with them, and they could live in parallel communities, parallel to the Ummah, and they were to be treated with respect, and in fact, they were treated a lot better than pagans were, and they were treated a lot better than apostate Muslims were. This originates in the Quran, but it is brought into sort of legal precedence in the Pact of Omar. The Pact of Omar was a treaty that was written between the rightly guided Caliph Umar and the Christians of Syria, and it becomes a template for how the Dhimma are to be treated. It becomes a key precedence. So under the Pact of Umar, Jews and Christians are to be taxed. They're to have some sort of distinguishing dress in public to distinguish them from Muslims. They are prohibited from engaging in blasphemy against Islam. They are prohibited against seeking converts of Muslims, and they're also prohibited against committing physical or social harm to Jews who convert to Islam. So they're not allowed to convert Muslims to Judaism, and they're not allowed to fight against Jews converting to Islam. They, in the Pact of Umar, Jews are expected to give loyalty to the Muslim leadership in exchange for this tolerance, and they're supposed to give Muslims general respect and friendliness, and they are expected to maintain sort of a humbleness of person, so to avoid ostentatious wealth, to avoid spectacles, religious spectacles, and to keep their buildings discreet and not compete, I guess, on the landscape with the buildings of Muslims. So synagogues were allowed, but they were meant to be discreet. And obviously this is simply a template, it's simply a precedence, and obviously there's a lot of variation in the application of dhimmi policies. But the Pact of Umar is sort of the prototypical dhimmi policies. Often dhimmi policies offered protection from violence, freedom of religion, freedom of movement and career, access to education, and all of those things in exchange for taxes, humbleness, respectfulness, and generally a prohibition against blasphemy or harming Islam in any way. There were some negative versions that exist. Some dhimmi policies require Jews to wear bells so that Muslims could not be sneaked up on by Jews. There were dhimmi policies that required Jews to wear red shoes so that Muslims could identify them. Many dhimmi policies that required Jews to be effectively ghettoized for their own protection and autonomy, but also because of a fear that they would be a bad influence. One Yemenite dhimmi policy stipulated that all Jewish orphans would be raised as Muslims, would be handed over to Islamic families to be raised as Muslims. And in that same policy, Jews were prohibited from going out in the rain for fear that the rainwater coming off the Jews would contaminate Muslims. So it was not all unicorns and rainbows, that's for sure. There were some negative dhimmi policies. Later Islamic policy, well, we'll talk about the Ottoman Empire in a moment, but later Islamic policy really depends on the millet system, which we'll look at momentarily. Okay, so integration under Islam really meant that Jews from different places of the Islamic world had the ability to communicate more freely, to travel. There was a certain unity to Jewish networks throughout the Islamic world, and freedom to travel and communicate, freedom of profession and education, which were massive boons, and the ability to be more involved with non-Jewish life and politics. So Jewish Spain, or the Islamic Spain, Jewish life in Islamic Spain, up until the 14th century, we have what is referred to Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain, beginning in 711 into the 12th century is what we refer to as the Golden Age, and Muslim Spain ends entirely in 1492 as the Spanish retake, or the Catholic Spanish retake Spain. So the Sephardim under Islam experience a golden age. They welcomed the Muslims in 711 because the Visigoth Catholics were incredibly brutal towards the Jews. They employed an anti-Judaic policy that involved the surrendering of Jewish children to the state, for example, which was a major offense, obviously. Jewish children were taken by Catholics to be raised as Catholics. So in 711, when Muslim forces took Spain, Jews welcomed the change from Christian rule to Muslim rule because the Visigoth Catholics were rather brutal. And this was under the Umayyads, who were a people it was a dynasty that was generally very tolerant. And this ushered in a golden age of prosperity and relative stability through the 10th to the 12th century, particularly in Cordova. The 10th to 12th century, the golden age of Muslim Spain, is something of a renaissance for both Islam and Judaism, or renaissance, if you want to say it that way. I'm from the East Coast, we don't say anything right. And this is a period of peace, prosperity, wealth, stability, and massive art, scientific, medical, mathematical, astronomy, philosophy productive period. And this is why we call it the Golden Age. It's one of the periods of some of the most beautiful architecture to come out of the Jewish world, as you saw in your documentary. It's one of the periods of intense productivity. Now, under Islamic rule, and in some places in Christian Europe, we get the rise of what has been referred to as court Jews. Court Jews were those Jews of influence who held favor in the ruling courts. They often came from money and were often tied into the power structure of the non-Jewish authorities. Now, the term court Jews is now frequently pejorative. It was used heavily by anti-Semites to refer to sort of the untrustworthy court Jews that infiltrate governments and control well-meaning non-Jewish governments for the Jewish agenda. So the term court Jew is problematic, to say the least. But we have to talk about the presence of court Jews in the Islamic world, because for the most part, court Jews use their money and influence to advocate on the behalf of other Jews. They use their money to fund life of less privileged Jews. And even though they had favor and influence in the court, they were often not regarded very favorably by other Jews and by other competing jealous sources in these particular ruling courts, and were often the very first victims of reform. So court Jews play an enormous role in the Islamic world, insofar as they advocate for Jewish position. They contribute to the kingdoms, the ruling classes that they lived under, but often paid the price of being sort of the first sacrifices of outbreaks of Jewish violence. In the Islamic world, court Jews were often go by the much nicer title, the Nazi, Nasi, which generally means the princes of the Jews, and they were often looked to as leaders of their communities and interfaced with Muslim authorities on behalf of the communities. So while the term now is often quite pejorative, they are important figures in history. And the reason we have to learn about that now is because the first Sephardic displacements, that is sort of when the Golden Age declines and when Muslim-Jewish relations break down, one of the first major instances of this in 1066, the Granada Massacre, was actually brought on by heavy criticism of a Nazi by a court Jew, Joseph ibn Negrela, who was the son of Samuel ibn Negrela. So he was the son of sort of a dynasty of court Jews, or Nazi. He came from a wealthy family. And in 1066, rumors climbed that he was not humble enough, that he had climbed too high, he had too much power, too much wealth. He was living extravagantly and ostentatiously, thereby breaking the policy of the dhimmi tolerance. And there were rumors of sort of sex orgies and deviant lifestyle issues. And Joseph ibn Negrela was crucified in 1066, leading to the Granada Massacre, in which about 4,000 Jews were murdered in Granada. So sometimes court Jews did amazing things to help their communities, and sometimes they became lightning rods for criticism that ultimately harmed the Jewish community. The Nazi were incredibly pressured by the concepts of dishonoring the name or dishonoring the community and honoring the community. So if a Nazi was good, he brought honor and clout to the Jews. If a Nazi was not a likable person for whatever reason or acted badly, he brought shame on the community. And again, just like in Christian Europe, you do have instances in which all Jews are punished for the activities of one. So in 1066, this is really the big break of things going really well. The end of the Golden Age comes with the decline of the Umayyads, the decline of stability, a general financial decline that comes with instability. And it comes to a head with a few expulsions of Jews from from Islamic Spain. Expulsions are less common in the Islamic world, but they're still a reality for Jews throughout the Middle Ages. Christian Europe was heavy on the expulsions. They still do occur. They're rarer in the Islamic world, but they still do occur. In 1147, Sephardic Jews were expelled in the first Sephardic displacement. They fled to the east and to Egypt or northern Africa, where they maintained Sephardic identity even as they lived alongside Mizrahi or Maghrebi Jews. And this is one of the reasons why Mizrahi Jews and Maghrebi Jews adopt a lot of Sephardic ways of life. And the first comes under the Almoravids, which was a conservative Islamic sect, sort of a very brief conservative dynasty that actually targeted Christians in Muslim Spain, and the Jews were sort of wrapped up in the targeting of Christians in Spain. And then moving on to that is the Almohades, another staunch, reactive, conservative Muslim group who actually came up from northern Africa to take Spain from other Muslims. They were responsible for a massacre in Fez in Morocco here in 1146, and then they move in to Spain, including Cordoba, and they were they enacted a mass expulsion of Jews from their provinces because they felt that all of the existing Islamic caliphates were too soft on Jews and Christians, and it was time to force conversion. They believed that Muhammad's tolerance for the Jews was never meant to last forever, that the dhimmi policy was only a temporary measure, and that eventually all of the Jews and Christians should just convert to Islam. So they did not feel obligated to continue the Pact of Umar or the dhimmi policies that are described in the Quran, because they felt that those things had natural time limits and the time had come. So one of the major projects of the Almohades was to rid their lands of Christians and Jews and to end dhimmi tolerance. So many Jews at this point move into northern Europe or northern Africa. Some move into Europe, and many move into other Islamic lands to the east. Now, in Spain, all this time from 8th century to the 15th century, Catholic Spanish groups were attempting the reconquista, or the reconquering of Spain. And as the Catholics reconquered Spain, they were very, very aware that the Jews had supported Muslim rule, had welcomed Muslim rule, and the Catholic Spaniards generally saw Jews with suspicion, that they were afraid the Jews would do whatever they could to sabotage Catholic Spanish aims and to help the Muslims in their war. Jews and Muslims were generally punished and restricted and treated with suspicion as Catholics retook Spain. In 1391, we have what has been described as the most significant outbreak of anti-Jewish violence in all of the European Middle Ages. And that should tell you a lot, because there was a lot of outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence in the Middle Ages in Europe. In 1391, it's a massacre that starts in Seville and effectively moves throughout Catholic Spain, and many, many Jews were killed. And it's at this point that Spanish Catholic authorities effectively tell Muslims and Jews, look, you need to become Catholics or you need to get out. And this culminates in 1492 with the mass expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. If they had not converted, they needed to leave. which of course is implicated with the Inquisition, which we already looked at, which was a deep suspicion that Jews and Muslims who convert to Catholicism are still secretly practicing Judaism and Islam on the sly. And it is with the Inquisition that we get the sort of the creation of the idea of Jewish blood as being inherently contaminating or inherently suspicious. And it is in 1492, the Edict of Expulsion, where all Jews are thrown out of Spain. This ends sort of the remnants of Islamic Spain and to some extent the remnants of Jewish Spain for some time. And this is the second displacement and sometimes referred to as the Great Sephardic Displacement because it was so total. And the Jews migrate to the world. Many go into Europe. They establish communities in Amsterdam, for example. Many go into North Africa and into Italy. Many go into Greece and to the east. Some go as far as India. And many go towards America in the subsequent centuries. And in fact, the first Jews in America were Sephardic. They had money and they were more adventurous and they were more cosmopolitan and they were more used to traveling. So this made them sort of ideal to take the journey to the Americas. Okay, so if you're wondering what's happening in Jerusalem, because I feel like in Unit 1 we talked about Jerusalem a lot, but Jerusalem has sort of been forgotten here. In 1099, remember with 1096, the First Crusade happens. Christians managed to take Jerusalem and they established the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem in 1099, which is immediately followed by an ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, where Jews and Muslims are slaughtered en masse by Christians. And it's a site of a great massacre in 1099. So there's a lot of devastation going on in this period, but there's also a lot of prosperity too. The expulsions, obviously 1099 was a devastating, 1391 was devastating, 1492 was devastating because not only was it an expulsion, but it led to an outbreak of plague amongst Jews, and they were stuck trying to reorient themselves, reroute themselves. Many Jews from the Sephardic expulsion ended up going to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was an incredibly old empire from 1299 to 1923, and it's effectively Turkey. So Anatolia, Asia Minor, into Europe as far as the Danube, into Northern Africa, and the Holy Land. So the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power was incredibly huge. And in fact, over half of the world's Jews lived in the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s. These included Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Maghrebi Jews, and some Ashkenazi Jews, as well as the assorted cultural groups like the Romaniotes. So the Ottoman Empire encompasses a great wealth of Jewish diversity. What happened, why so many Jews moved there, is because, well, out of desperation, they needed to move somewhere, but often they were actually invited by the Ottoman Empire to move into their lands when they were expelled from other places. The Ottoman Empire, at various points, attempted to establish what could be referred to as the Old Yeshuv. Looking at the model of Cyrus, the Ottoman Empire decided that if we need to foster loyalty by offering tolerance, just like old Cyrus the Great of Persia did. So they invited Jews to return to the Old Yeshiv, their ancient homelands, because they believed that increasing the number of Jews was good for their country. And they did well. There was a very mutually beneficial relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the Jews who moved to to their lands. So much so that one medieval Spanish observer said that the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the Jews were so mutually beneficial that, quote, the Sephardic should have just been exterminated rather than survive and enrich the Turks. So this was it was a loss for Europe in these expulsions, and the Ottoman Empire was ready to capitalize on that loss. So policies within the Ottoman Empire, look, you're looking at hundreds of years here, so obviously the policies did vary. The dhimmi policy remained in effect, which was a balance or a series of protections and restrictions. The Pact of Umar was its prototype, and generally religious freedom and freedom from crime was part of that, but also included a Jewish quarter and a Jewish cemetery for Jewish use. And this Jewish quarter kind of turned into ghettos throughout the Ottoman Empire. Through the millet system. The millet meaning sort of salt. You sprinkle salt around. The Ottoman Empire was happy to invite Jews to their places, and they were happy to give Jews quarters, but that also meant that they felt they had the right to simply uproot and move Jewish communities to new places if they felt they needed salt to add salt to their cities. They believed that adding Jewish communities to cities was good for the economy, good for the professional side of these places. So they would simply scoop up Jews and tell them to move to different places to add salt to these places. So would I be happy living under that system? No, I've experienced too much freedom. Too much freedom sounds wrong, but I've experienced too much freedoms in my life to be happy living under this system. But to the Jews of the Middle Ages, it probably didn't seem like that bad of a deal. They weren't expelled. They were allowed to take their stuff. They were just simply redeployed and moved around. So Jews under the Ottoman Empire were not full citizens necessarily. They were resident aliens, but under the dhimmi policy, they were protected. And under the millet system, they had quarters and cemeteries for their use, but also under the millet system, they could be moved around at the will of the authority. Again, compared to the Christian world, this is not this bad of a deal, but compared to the way we live now, probably not that appealing. Okay, so under Islam, obviously this covers a wealth of history and a wealth of diversity. It's a mixed bag. There are moments of persecution, intense violence, but the majority of it is a story of tolerance and coexistence. Jews remain aliens in the Islamic world, and that made them targets. But as a general trend, Muslims were much more tolerant of Jews than Christians, and Muslims and Jews managed a pretty mutually beneficial relationship throughout the Middle Ages. Periods of stability led to periods of prosperity and peace and general wealth. Periods of instability often led to violence and persecution and loss of wealth, much the same as we see throughout the Middle Ages. But by and large, the Sephardic tradition has its roots in art and literature and prosperity and science and cosmopolitanism, because they were granted freedoms and privileges and rights that the Ashkenazi Jews simply did not enjoy in Christian Europe. And I think that's sort of the take-home point of this lecture. Okay, so that's it. I'm a little over time. I will remind you that you have your second unit test coming up on November 9th, and your second of 3 unit papers are due on November 12th, and that one will deal with Ashkenazi and Sephardim. And actually, I think the Mizrahi, if you would like to include them, particularly if you have a personal connection to the Mizrahi community, you can specifically also address the Mizrahi community in that paper. I will edit the paper instructions to reflect that. Okay, so your discussion forum post for this week is to define the Sephardim and describe some of the ways that the Sephardic ways of life was shaped by their historical contexts, and what were some of the main trends of the Sephardic Middle Ages. Again, also, if you would like to include a paragraph on the Mizrahi, please do so as well. The Mizrahi do not get as much attention as they should, so I'm happy if you want to include that as well for your classmates to read. I think it would be beneficial for everyone. Okay, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can discuss lecture material or readings on the My Learning Space forums with your classmates. You can email me at any time. You can come to my office hours today at 4 or set up a separate appointment. I do encourage you to start thinking about that final paper if you haven't yet. So if you're thinking about the final paper and you have questions about your topic, or you're trying to come up with a topic, come to the office hours. That would be an ideal time. Or you can email me and we'll talk about it, okay? That's it for today. I will see you next Tuesday with Lecture 14 as we continue on with the Sephardim, and we look specifically at Sephardic Judaism and culture next Tuesday. And then next Thursday will be class 14 on Tuesday. It'll be class 15 on next Thursday, and that will be the test review, okay? So bye for now. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.